Please rise in body and spirit to join in singing Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone. It is a Chris Tomlin adaptation of John Newton's classic hymn. How is everybody doing? Good. You know, it's amazing. Unitarians, right? Unitarians. You got an extra hour to sleep in, and people are still showing up 5 minutes late. What? I don't know. I don't get it. But be that as it may, welcome to the home of Unitarian Universalism in Central Washington. I am Steve Clem. I'm your celebrant today, and today's speaker is Ben Knecht. November is National Native American Heritage Month, during which we will be celebrating Alaskan Native, American Native, Native Hawaiian, and island community traditions, language, and culture throughout our country. Today's service will focus on Ben's journey to understand and accept the history of the Native Americans in the region where he was raised, and to support the land acknowledgement language we traditionally use for the tribes of North Central Washington. If you are a visitor today, we are so glad you're here. And let's now turn to the rear of the sanctuary and let's wave for our friends that are here via Zoom. We welcome every person of goodwill just as you are. Whomever you love, whatever body you inhabit, whatever your age, you are welcome here. We invite you to join us after the service for a coffee social hour, both in person and on Zoom. And for those of you on Zoom, you can find our order of service in the chat. And now, please take a moment or two to greet your neighbor.
Wow, I got a full church today. Ooh.
And now, we bring you a very special announcement from the Auction Committee.
We're off to CUUF's wonderful land of Oz auction.
Who did you get to do?
The auction is almost here, with lots of things to make you say, ah.
Party!
Put on your party clothes and come to the auction at 6 p.m. this coming Saturday. This is the live auction. And bring your cash, credit cards, checks.
Donate!
The last day to donate is this coming Wednesday.
Preview.
Browse the online catalog, online now, to see items that you can bid on. Silent bidding continues in the sanctuary. They will be posted in here until November 24th.
Live.
The live auctions, loads of fun. And this year you have the option to join the party online to bid on live auction items as well.
Volunteer.
Many hands make light work.
Attend.
Let us know if you're attending. And it's an $8 donation at the door. Scholarships are available so everyone can attend. See Kathy after the service for anything about the auction, or contact my wife, Louise, or Rita by phone or email. And now,
We're off to CUUF's auction, wonderful land of auction. I can read that.
We gather on the homeland of the Pasquasha, and that's actually how they say it, where they lived for generations upon generations as stewards of this land, and they still live here, continuing their traditions. The rest of this morning's land acknowledgement comes from the words of Native American activist and poet John Trudell. In his poem, Cry Your Tears, he rejects the guilt of white Americans, how they seek sympathetic innocence, and seek empathy for their self-inflicted wounds. It is lengthy but very powerful, and that is why it's included as a handout. Cry Your Tears by John Trudell. Now you want us to cry your tears for you after we've already bled for you, already been dead to you. Now you want us to cry your tears for you. Chapters of a democracy story, descendants of genocide, 12 score and more years ago, we went from being the majority to being the smallest minority. Now you want us to cry your tears for you. We saw the emptying early morning skyline, back through that horizon, Duck Valley, 1979, Wounded Knee, Sand Creek, that trail of tears. Exactly how did our land become your country? Now you want us to cry your tears for you while we're still crying tears of our own. With your past as your future, that industrial ruling class using religion as a weapon, distilling love into hate, pointing fingers and name-calling evil, sacrificing lives and blood, making the innocent the new virgins, offerings to the gods of profit. Now you want us to cry your tears for you. In the homeland security, pretending corporate corruption isn't economic terrorism. Money talks while the government listens, compiling files on ones who think different, conditioning an acceptance of debt and not to expect the truth. So get used to hearing the lie. Now you want us to cry your tears for you. Misusing the beauty, turning freedom into a killing machine, mass murdering the environment, weaponizing the psychology of fear, and pushing material addiction with a substitution of rules, faking the law. The Bill of Rights becomes collateral damage, making the Constitution another broken treaty. Now you want us to cry your tears for you. The way this story is unfolding, we may end up crying together, as in crying at the same time. But we're short on tears to cry for you, with all these tears to cry of our own. Now you want us to cry your tears for you. If you want to have more information about Indigenous rights and reparations and Indigenous advocacy organizations, you can go to the CUUF website where you will find links. This month, our worship focus is the UU value of pluralism, as set out in Article 2. And I'm going to be reading right now from Article 2. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant congregation to congregation and through our association to support and assist one another in our ministries. We draw from our heritages of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable from one another, these shared values include pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. And this morning, may we find wisdom and inspiration that will enrich our lives with purpose, compassion, and humility. So come, let us worship together and start with the kindling of a sacred flame. A symbol of our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition is a sacred flame within a chalice, and we join Unitarians, Unitarian Universalists all over the world in lighting our chalices this morning. If you're here by video, please light your own chalice. Now, please join in this call and response adapted from Remembrance, written by Native American poet Joy Harjo, who was appointed the United States Poet Laureate in 2019. And I will note that there are some additional lines that are in the order of service that are not included, and we will, for the purposes of making it a little shorter, so we will, if you would look at the screen and use those words, call and response. Remember the sky that you were born under.
Know each of the stars' stories.
Remember the moon.
Know who she is.
Remember the sun's birth at dawn.
That is the strongest point of time.
Remember the earth whose skin you are.
We are earth, red, black, yellow, white, brown.
Remember the plants, trees, and animal life.
They are alive and bones.
Remember the wind.
She knows the origin of this universe.
Remember you are all people.
And all people are you.
Remember you are this universe.
And this universe is you.
Remember.
These are today's wisdom readings. My first reading is from Professor Ned Blackhawk, recent history book, The Rediscovery of America. He won the National Book Award and is professor of history at Yale University. If you want to tackle a non-white historian's history of America, this is a good starter. He says, how can a nation founded on the homelands of dispossessed indigenous people be the world's most exemplary democracy? This question haunts America as it does other settler nations. Among historians, silence, rather than engagement, has been the most common response, together with a continued unwillingness to see America's diversity from the vantage point of the most impacted with the expansion of the United States, the American Indian. Historians have largely focused on the Europeans and their descendants. Puritans governing the Commonwealth in the wilderness, pioneers settling western frontiers, the European immigrants huddled upon the Atlantic shores. Scholars have long conflated the US history with Europeans, maintaining that the United States evolved from its British settlements. The next reading is from Professor Spencer, anthropologist from Arizona. For 250 years, following the first European invasions of the region that became the United States, no one people was politically dominant. From 1540, when the Spaniards initiated the first expansion westward, marches under Coronado in the west and De Soto in the east, the struggle for dominance continued for nearly 3 centuries. For the Indians, both in the east and the west, there was certainly no clear indication until perhaps the late 1700s. Then any of the 5 new-coming European nations would emerge triumphant. Until that time, the views of most Indians seemed to have been that some kind of balance of power might be struck among the warlike Europeans and themselves, and that a new equilibrium of many nations would thus be established.
So there is no time for all ages story this morning. In keeping with honoring the traditions of the Musqueam and other Salish tribes of the Colville Nation, stories are not told until after the winter solstice. And do we have children present? I do not see a small human. All right. So, Lynn?
As we were designing the service today,
Each Sunday, we set aside time to share and honor the events which have impacted us in a deep, personal way. This is not a time for politics or advertisement. It is a time of reverence, of care, and of intention during which we open doors to each other to allow for further connection. Let us take a moment to pause and think how we might be mindful of the way we minister to each other. We each have the responsibility to share only what we have permission to share, to take care of the time we use, and to support each other in our sharing. To share, please come forward, say your name. That helps pastoral care team, and it helps us all know one another better. And who do we have from pastoral care today? Oh, Stephanie. All right. Thank you, Stephanie. If you are participating by Zoom, you can share your joy or sorrow in the chat. And I will light one more candle for those joys, those sorrows, those events in our life which we carry in our hearts but are too tender to share. And while we sing, I Am Enough, from our seats, you may come forward and silently light a candle for all that is unspoken. And when the singing is complete, please create space for some silent prayer or meditation.
good morning. So Sandy and I got the message that we set the clocks back, but our kitty Dexter didn't get the message. So at the old 5 o'clock, he was there. Well, several years ago, I was sitting in these pews here for my usual Sunday CUUF fix when the usual opening process had gone on, and then something new, a land acknowledgement, related that we were on Musqueam land and had deviously stolen this land from them. Now, as a Unitarian, I'd been exposed to a lot of these liberal ideas, and coming from the upper Midwest, South Dakota heritage, it was always challenging. What background was in my mind when I heard this? I'd recently become aware of the schools that were created to make white kids out of Indian kids. I had been ruminating about the bias that I had been taught about Native Americans. This background led to my first unthinking thought when I heard that land acknowledgement. I'm one of those guilty white guys who stuck it to the Indians, and my fellowship is blaming me. I'm going to review with you some of my journey dealing with this guilt feeling and my thinking. To get you started on this journey, we need to set the context. I want to take you back to Rapid City, South Dakota, to 1950. Now, I know this is a stretch for a lot of you, so you might want to close your eyes to get into this. I'm 12 years old. At this age, I think my major values about life are picked up. My values will be based on the world I'm exposed to in this rural town of 23,000 people. White, mostly Protestant, Northern European, recent kids of late 1800s immigrants. My dad, Ben, is part of a large lumber yard built by his dad and brothers. In 1950, South Dakota had a population of 650,000 people. Of these, 700 were Black and 23,000 Indians, or as the 1950 census says, 3.6% of the population's others. From kindergarten to high school, the only Indian I had in my class was Marvin Amiot. Later in high school, Vince Whipple came in and was a hero on the basketball court. Like most Americans, I thought of the Indians as that romantic figure in American history, best portrayed in the many cowboy and Indian movies I saw as a kid. My young buddies and I, we played cowboys and Indians all around the neighborhood of Rapid City. We were living the myth of the entitled white settlers I grew up with. Okay, now if you close your eyes, you can open them. What did I learn in school about Indigenous Indians? A grad student recently published a paper summarizing the history books that students had in 1950. These chapters are sort of a series of unconnected segments. For example, the colonial roots of Americans' founding ideals, and how the Indigenous Indians helped the 1607 Jamestown settlers, and of course the 1620 Mayflower Pilgrims. But then, almost every book examined, Indigenous people disappear. Well, they pop up here and there, but it doesn't fit anything, and usually it's some confrontation with the whites. What did my society teach me? A story from my dad will give you a sense of my society's notions about Lakota Indians. Dad related he had first hired many local Sioux who came off the reservation to make some money and do some work. Some would show up after payday. Some would not show up after payday the following day, and some would even come in drunk the next day. Dad soon didn't hire them. On Sunday after church, it was our custom to go and drive around Rapid City to see what was going on. If we saw a dilapidated house with a bunch of junker cars and other junk, Dad would suggest, this must be an Indian house. Even now, when driving near a reservation and I see the housing, I can recall my dad's words. To thousands of Americans, the Indian is and always will be dirty, drunk, and lazy. That's how they picture him, and that's how they treat him. This land acknowledgement's occurring in all kinds of organizations. I'm fascinated by the intense emotions that I hear regarding this, such as, well, it was a prior generation that got the land. It happened, it happened. We bullied our way in, we fought for it, it's ours, and it's well worth it. That's an insult. They lost and we won. A minister I interviewed related her first impression was confusion. she wanted to push back against this concept. I think, like my guilt feeling, the first emotion that comes up in folks relates to the complex backstory that we all have developed over time about the others. My minister friend had read a lot about Native American spiritual life that left her with a very positive emotion. It only took her a while to feel good about the land acknowledgement. I've been dealing with my guilt feelings these last few years with study, questioning others, and personal reflection. I now feel more anger that I was so ignorant of Indigenous Native history in general, and more specifically South Dakota's Indian history. I'm going to talk about a few of the highlights, just the highlights I've learned. Hopefully they'll enrich all of your thinking and broaden it about the Indian that we live with. The real education about my home state and the federal government's treatment of the Sioux neighbors whom I grew up with occurred when I read the Secretary of Interior's report on the government's Indian boarding school initiative. She released this in May 2022. Volume 2 is also available and you can read it online. The report's scary, grim, and upsetting, yet it only deals with one issue about white man's relations with our Indigenous people, that of forcing Indian children into boarding schools. So it was 1879. The Civil War and Reconstruction was over, and the government could get back to what became a policy of eradicating indigenous Indian cultures. Captain Pratt developed a teaching idea that a military-style education would discipline Native children to become more like white children. He got funding for this from Congress and created the first Indian industrial school in the old Army barracks at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's noted for his famous quote that all of the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and you save the man. Pratt and other reformers hoped that assimilation would impart civilization to these children. They believed that Indian families were deficient, they needed restructured. Even the Supreme Court's ruling in 1903 said that Indians were an ignorant and dependent race. The Carlisle school model was a standard for a future form of segregated Indian schools. These worked hard at preventing the transmission of Indian languages, religions, cultural values, affection between parents and children from one generation to the next. Government agents would come into a house and take these children from their families and enroll them in the boarding school from up to 2 to 5 years. Some of them were sent to school hundreds of miles away from their villages. The government and the Roman Catholic school experience was the harshest. The comfortable buckskin garments and moccasins were burned and exchanged for wool trousers, skirts, and hard shoes. Their long hair was cut. The Indian custom was not to cut the hair until you died. They were given an English name or a number. Instruction was in English. They were punished if they used tribal language or religion. Rules were enforced through punishment, which included confinement, withholding food, whipping, slapping, or cuffing, often in front of the whole class. I watched a video of an 85-year-old Sioux who had been at boarding school, and he described how they made him take a rubber band in his teeth and then pull it out and let it go. There was no contact with their families. They learned Christianity, the English language, and trades that were markable to white society. Summers when they were rented out to local farmers, it was called outings. The common thread of belief by white society in the boarding school system was that neither parent nor child had the intellectual ability to learn anything more than manual trades that benefited white people. When these children returned to the reservation, they were often confused and alienated from their families. If they readopted to the traditional customs, they were scornfully described by the whites as going back to the blanket. In today's thinking, the schools were a form of cultural genocide. As I read this report, I was disgusted and amazed at my own ignorance. All my Rapid City life, I'd driven by the Sioux Sanitarium on my way to Canyon Lake. This is a big, stately building up on a hill with nice red rocks that cover it. I was told it was built for the Indians to treat their tuberculosis. No. It was a repurposed Indian boarding school that was built in Rapid City in 1898. It took at least 200 children from around the plains of Rapid City, and it existed till 1933. South Dakota had 31 boarding schools. Only 2 states had more. By the way, Washington State had 15 boarding schools. There were a total of 523 boarding schools in 37 states, Alaska, and Hawaii. Religious institutions were the major managers of the boarding schools, both on and off the reservations. The Catholics, by the way, had 82 of the schools, which were the most. This was an unprecedented delegation of power to religious bodies by a government. There was no central control. They were paid certain sums for each pupil, which was another way to make money for the church. This quote from an Indian agent tells a lot about the policy of government funding directly to religious organizations. The government aid enables them to sustain their missions and lead these peoples whose paganism has been the chief obstacle to their salvation, to the light of Christianity. Untold numbers suffered physical, sexual abuse, and at least 1,000 died due to disease, too strict of discipline, malnutrition. The parents were rarely informed of the child's death, and many are buried in unmarked graves around these schools. Even the Unitarians had a school. The Montana Industrial School for Indians was established in 1886 by the American Unitarian Association. The school was located on the Crow Indian Reservation. 50 Native children at the time lived at the school. The school closed after a decade when the government quit paying the $108 annual pupil fee. The good and mostly bad stories about making an Indian child into a white child consumes volumes of well-documented material. Well, that upsets me even more. But what about this native land acknowledgement? I could start the story in 1492, when Spanish colonists introduced violence, disease, and carnage across the hemisphere. As I noted in the beginning, I'd rather focus on more recent history in my home state. From 1832 to 1871, American Indians were treated as other nations were. We negotiated the treaty with them between the tribe and the US. This was approved by the Senate, and it then became the supreme law of the land. For upper Midwest tribes, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty was the last treaty recognizing extensive tracts as Indian territories. It ended Red Cloud's War, which had erupted over the settlers' use of the Bozeman Trail. A meteoric growth of immigrants had accelerated after the Civil War ended in 1885. This favorite trail went along the north of Nebraska, along the Platte River, cut across Wyoming, and then out into Montana. The Fort Laramie Trail, or the Fort Laramie Treaty, established the Great Sioux Reservation starting west of the Missouri River. It was among the most extensive in U.S. history, with over 50,000 square miles for Lakota people. Absolute, undisturbed use and occupation. The government agreed that no parties other than those authorized by the treaty would be allowed to pass over, settle upon, or reside in this territory. The United States wanted the tribes to end their nomadic life, settle down so there wouldn't be so much conflict with other Indians, the settlers, and the railroads. They had to accept this sedentary life of farming and then rely on the government handed out subsidies. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse rejected this reservation system, as did some warriors and hunters. The treaty included sacred Pahasapa. Now, I know this area as the Black Hills. My hometown, Rapid City, calls itself the gateway to the Black Hills. Since the Sioux migrated from Minnesota in the early 1800s, they have called the Black Hills their sacred area because they believe the great Manitou resides there. Without permission from the reservation Indians, in late 1874, General George Custer entered the Black Hills with over 1,000 troops and a bunch of specialists to investigate the area. Some of the geologists discovered gold down by Custer, and they published this in the Chicago newspapers. This news about Black Hills gold resulted in 800 miners and other types coming per week to this federally protected land looking for gold. Of course, the pouring in of the whites to the Great Sioux Reservation led to the expected turmoil. 2 years later, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued an ultimatum that all of the Indians were to be on the reservation or they'd be treated as hostiles and shot. In June, over 2,000 cavalry and infantry were sent to force these hostiles onto the reservation. Now, you can read volumes, and I've looked at them all, about these cavalry units of Custer's who were defeated and lost their 210 men at the Battle of Little Bighorn by 1,500 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, who they were supposed to round up, by the way. But unfortunately, within a year, hostiles had surrendered and the Black Hills was taken by the US government. Now, Congress was mad about Custer's defeat. The previous passage of the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 by the House of Representatives said that no longer did the U.S. recognize tribes as nations. Now Congress could use its unbridled authority to override the existing treaties, even though the Constitution didn't give them this power. Congress began taking these Indian lands. It was called, among other things, starve and sell. It made land cession a precondition to getting rations. It gave individual Indians 160 acres. Now the white man could by devious means acquire the reservation land. These policies led to two-thirds of the Indian reservation land being lost. Then with the murder of Sitting Bull and the massacre of 300 Sioux women, men, and children at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890, the conquest of the American Indian was complete. Of course, this story goes on even now. Native Americans finally got their citizenship in 1924. It wasn't until 1971 that the U.S. determined that separation of Indian children from their families was a tragic and destructive aspect of our Indian policy, and they ended it. President Biden on October 25th, for the first time, apologized to Native people of our government's horrible wrong and sin in our soul. As he said, this policy is long overdue. Now, I've sort of given you the highlights of just some of the Native Americans stuff that I read and dealt with. So where am I with all this thinking and talking and wondering? My minister friend suggested that she had moved to a feeling of compassion. When I imagine the psychological, emotional, ego-destroying results of 2 to 3 generations of indigenous Indians being sequestered in these Indian schools, I have compassion. If my grandfather, then my dad, and then myself had been sent to a South Dakota Indian boarding school, I too would have gone back to the blanket on my reservation. For me, compassion was a better place than the guilt and anger I felt. I can now fully honor the land acknowledgement. We began our service by noting our UU values of pluralism. As you reflect on what you've heard and seen today, remember we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We make the bold attempt to agree to learn from one another and search for truth and meaning. We will accept our differences and find our commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. So join me in the extinguishing words that we all know. We extinguish this flame, not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we had in our hearts and apply in our lives. So we are together. Let's form our circle and sing our traditional song.